July 24th, 1971, Osappo, Italy. 25-year-old Simonetta Ferrero would leave her home around 10:30 a.m., intending to run a few last-minute errands before she departed for Corsica later that day. Over the next hour, she would stop at a few shops picking up some supplies for her trip, like hair conditioner, deodorant, and a French-Italian dictionary, before finally going to exchange some Italian currency for French. She would leave those shops around 11:30 a.m., intending to head to an upholstery to drop off a piece of fabric, then go to a beautician. However, her plans would change, and it's still not known why to this day, which is just a small part of this overarching mystery, because she would decide to stop at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart, her alma mater, where she graduated from 2 years prior. Since it was in the middle of the summer, most of the college kids were on break, and the school was pretty empty. There were a few stragglers here and there, along with a custodian and 4 construction workers who were on the first floor pounding away with jackhammers. All in all, there were about 50 people on the university grounds. Now, as mentioned, it's unsure what her real reason was for stopping here, but there are a few different claims, such as making photocopies for a friend, or picking up a book for a friend, or a leaflet. In most sources, there is always the mention that she was doing something on behalf of a friend, but it's also possible she just stopped to use the restroom, since that's where this mystery would play out. Regardless of the reason, this is when tragedy would enter the picture, because Simonetta's parents were at home waiting on her, as the three had intended to have lunch together at 1 p.m. As the time passed, they began to wonder why she had not called them yet to let them know that she was going to be late. It was not like her to just not show up, and even less like her to not notify them. Soon, the wonder turned to worry, and by 4 p.m., when they still had not heard from her, they contacted the police, and they canceled their family trip to Corsica, and they began searching for Simonetta. But the search provided no details at first, and everyone was kinda stumped. She had been spotted by a few individuals at the university, yet no one had seen her leave. I can only guess the people there had not been informed about her disappearance, hence the reason no one searched the university. But 2 days later, after Monday Mass, the seminarian was walking through the halls of the university when he suddenly heard something. It was a faucet, continuously running in the girls' bathroom. Knowing that no one was there, and not wanting to waste water, he simply walked in to turn the faucet off. But as he walked in, he was hit with a foul odor, a strong, acrid smell. He took a couple of more steps, and that's when he suddenly spotted blood on the door. He nervously opened the door to reveal Simonetta was laying on the floor deceased, in a pool of blood, which seemed to be all over the walls, stall doors, and sink. He was of course shocked, and quickly rushed to the custodian, who then called the police. And within a matter of minutes, detectives were combing the scene. The young lady had been stabbed 33 times, or 42 in some sources, with only 7 of the wounds being fatal. They were able to tell that she had fought hard, as there were defensive wounds on her arms and even bits of the killer's skin under her fingernails. Her hands even showed where she attempted to take it away by grabbing the blade. The whole struggle was thought to have taken place over 2 to 3 minutes, and here's where it gets stranger. There was seemingly no motive, because there were no signs that she had been sexually violated, or even any attempt at it. Likewise, her jewelry and a large sum of money were still left on her untouched. The time of the murder was eventually placed between 12 and 2, meaning she was spotted by witnesses just 30 minutes prior. And it's even stranger when you take into consideration of the location, which was that of the restroom. Not only do we not know why she was back at the school, but she walked past another restroom to get to this one, the one that was being worked on from the floor below by the construction workers, which just adds another odd element to the whole thing. As far as who, well, that was weird too. Judging by a handprint the man left on the wall, they estimated he was about 5'11" or 6 foot tall. But where in the world to even start? I mean, there were only a few people at the university, so I had to be one of them, right? Well, that's what investigators thought too. First, they actually looked at the custodian of the school. along with the 4 construction workers, which, speaking of, it's these 4 that actually drowned out the sounds of the attack taking place, as detectives had wondered how such a heinous brutal attack could have occurred, one in which Simonetta fought back valiantly and was somehow not heard. Well, it's because these guys were down there running jackhammers, which basically muted out any sound. But after the detectives interviewed them, they soon realized that the men had stopped at 1 p.m. to have lunch, and then they got back to work, where they remained busy until 5 p.m. Then they called it a day, and the custodian locked up and left. None of these men had anything pertinent to add to the investigators' case, as they had not heard or seen anything. They even had the clothes they were wearing that day seized by the police and checked for blood, although I'm sure these guys had time to wash them by that point. But investigators must not have thought so, because all 5 men were dismissed as suspects, and they began to look at the case in a whole different way. Knowing this facility was like a maze, they naturally assumed it would almost had to been someone familiar with it, because this layout would throw off newcomers. So because of this, they postulated that it had to be one of the few students on campus, or one of the teachers, or someone involved with the university that day. Actually, they began to wonder if it was the seminarian, a 21-year-old named Mario Tozo. I mean, it seemed awful convenient. He just stumbled up onto the sound of running water. But it wasn't just that, because right after the police were called and arrived on the scene, Mario got on a train and got the heck out of there. He went back to his hometown, which certainly seemed pretty odd. Because of this, police told him to come right back to be interviewed, which he did 2 days later. But what at first seemed like a good theory fell to the wayside when detectives discovered he had no scratches or wounds, nor any trace of blood on his clothes, which again, I wonder if he simply could have not washed them. But police stated he was just real shaken up by the events, which is why he had went home, and he had nothing to do with it. Now detectives had to concede, whoever done this probably did come from the outside of the university, and somehow was able to pull all this off without getting lost or confused or spotted. In fact, they already had a few reports of strange men who had been on the university grounds weeks prior, just harassing female students. Not only is that surprising, but it's very creepy and sad. Anyways, since they already knew that these men were loitering around the school grounds, waiting on girls, they naturally made good suspects. They quickly found their best lead yet, a man who we only had the name of, Giuseppe. He was known to carry around knives, and he was mentally unhinged. After an interview with him, police soon found out that he had a rock-solid alibi, and was nowhere near at the time of the murder. Another man was found that often took the nearby train, where he could be found harassing the female passengers, and he often talked to people that knew him about how attractive the female students were at the nearby university. But what was really pulling them towards him was what they found at his home, a diary where he had written that he hated women and wanted to kill them all. So this had to be the guy, right? Well, unfortunately, he was too soon ruled out. They would then interview a man who was seen at the university carrying women's underwear, along with a 25-year-old man that would often talk vulgar to the girls who walked by. But soon, the stranger theory was ruled out, so they began to look closer into Simonetta's life. One thing that stuck out to them immediately was she had no boyfriend, no husband or lover, at least none that they could find. She was more career-minded, and because of that, she had not really had any serious relationship. She had a few dates here and there, but it was never serious. They also tried to find any men from her workplace who may have been rejected by her, but again, nothing like what had occurred, or not that police could find anyways. Over the next month, police would talk to nearly 360 people, and they were never able to develop one lead. And sadly, by the end of the year, the case was completely cold, and never really recovered, other than a false lead a couple of decades later, when in 1994, a government official was sent an anonymous letter from a woman who claimed that a spiritual director working at the university at the time of the murder, got fired 3 years later for sexually harassing a student. Of course, this old lead was investigated thoroughly, and, again, nothing was found. It's one of the darkest and most perplexing cases in Italian history. For one, nobody seemingly knew where all Simonetta was going that day, so it's doubtful that someone was just waiting on her. Which means they probably randomly seen her enter the school and then followed her inside. Or maybe they were already on the inside. But the strangest part is, how did he exit with all that blood on him? Obviously, he washed his hands and left the sink running, but police were confident he would have had a lot of blood on his clothing, which is how everyone at the university was ruled out. Or were they? Let's go back to those 4 construction workers. Although they were working at the time, covering up basically any noise of the murder, the prosecutor assigned to the case actually believed one of these men were ultimately responsible. He could never bring a case against him due to not having that crucial piece of evidence, and the motive shouldn't be surprising. He was sexually motivated, in spite of the fact there were no signs of it. More than likely, her fierce fighting back deterred him, which then set him off and led to the scene that transpired. But what about the clothing? Yeah, there's a simple answer for that too. See, one of the details that was released about the case decades later was that there were signs that the killer went to the bathroom stall where he then took off his bloody clothes and put them into a bag he took from nearby. Then he put on a new pair and walked out, which is why no one's seen anything odd. It's also most probable that the other construction workers at least heard the water running continuously and went to turn it off, and either discovered it and covered it up for him, or the killer dissuaded them from going to look somehow. However, this has also brought up another interesting theory, that it was a different motive altogether. At the time, students and faculty knew not to use the restroom cause it was being worked on, but she had not been a student for 2 years, and could have used the restroom, and the flush triggered a leak, or even flooding, because they were replacing pipes at that point, which was confirmed by local papers. This set off one of the workers, who went upstairs to confront her, and a physical confrontation ensued, and he snapped, hence why there were no signs of an attempted sexual violation. It also explains why he would wait until she attempted to exit the bathroom, instead of following her inside. Others are not happy with that theory, since it seems kind of unbelievable, and they instead point to a terrifying serial killer, one known as the Milan Monster, who operated between 1963 and 1976, and is believed responsible for the deaths of 7 to 11 women, and whose murders bore strong similarities. They all received around 30 stab wounds, primarily in the chest and abdomen, and they all occurred close to railway stations, religious institutions, or guest house linked to railway workers. There are other smaller theories, such as someone followed her to the restroom and waited for her to come out and made a sexual advance, which she declined, and it set him off. All the clues point to a spur-of-the-moment decision, so this could be it. Or it could have been something more to do with Simonetta's job, since part of her duties was hiring people, and if she declined an applicant, it could have left him upset, and he set out to get revenge. With it being over half a century now, this one will most likely never be solved. When I was younger, one thing I enjoyed doing was catfishing. Not the internet dating thing either. I'm talking about fishing for catfish. Many a summer nights, me and my cousin would stay out late into the early morning, dreaming of landing a big flathead. Well, most of the time, all we got was mosquito bites. But why do Americans, and people throughout the world, enjoy catfishing? Well, the better question is, why wouldn't you? If you like fishing, that is. Catfish by nature will pretty much eat anything, including other fish, night crawlers, hot dogs, crawdads, chicken livers, and even stink bait, giving the fishermen more opportunities and weapons to catch them. Which, did I mention, their size makes it a challenge to get them in, thereby increasing the fun. And finally, many are prized for their taste, as you can find them in many fish fries across the country. But what if these creatures are dangerous to humans, And I'm not talking about their ability to sting you with their horns. Yes, if you've never been catfishing, they have these sharp spines many people just call horns, and they will sting you. And since they're covered in mucus, it can cause the wound to get all infected. But as bad as that sounds, that's not even what this next cryptid mystery revolves around. No, that has more to do with their enormous size. Catfish, in particular blue cats, can get pretty big. There was even a local legend where I grew up of one blue cat that had eyes as big as car headlights. While that was probably nothing more than folklore, the record for a blue cat is 143 pounds and was caught in 2011. There was also the Wales catfish captured in Italy in 2023 that was over 9 feet long and about 280 pounds, along with the Mekong giant catfish in Asia, which has a record of almost 9 feet and 650 pounds. But what if there are bigger ones? What if there are giant man-eating catfish? That's what this cryptid mystery is about. It's hard to pinpoint when this story originated, as it seems like all kinds of small towns around the world have similar giant catfish legends. However, there is one intriguing one, and it comes from the Kali River in India and Nepal. The story begins in April 1998, when a 17-year-old boy was swimming with friends who seen him get dragged under the water, and he never resurfaced. His remains were never found. In spite of a 3-day, 3-mile search, this was the first of a series known as the Kali River Goonch attack, named so because of the Goonch catfish. Over the next 9 years, a series of fatal attacks would occur, supposedly perpetrated by this 200-pound catfish. The final attack came in 2007, when an 18-year-old was dragged down by something witnesses described as a mud-colored water pig. The story was interesting enough that Jeremy Wade, the same guy from that show, River Monsters, began to investigate it. He was skeptical at first, but upon hearing that the attacks were occurring in a small area of the river, he took a more open mind to it. The villagers told him that human remains from funeral pyres were often discarded in the river, possibly giving the fish a taste for human flesh. After using a depth sounder, Wade was able to rule out whirlpools as being responsible. In fact, it wasn't long after he started his investigation that a water buffalo was dragged under the water and drowned. Since they typically weigh around 800 pounds, Wade theorized that the fish had to weigh at least 200 to 300 pounds. What about crocodiles and sharks, you may ask? Yeah, those were eventually ruled out too, for varying reasons. Wade soon sighted a group of goonch, 6 of them that were the size of a man, and he came up with a plan. A funeral pyre would be used to see if one of them could be lured in, and sure enough, the following day, a record-breaking 6.5-foot, 160-pound goonch was captured. Wade speculated that it was strong and large enough to eat a small child, and he also theorized that there were probably bigger ones out there. He did state, though, that the one that he had captured could not be responsible for the several drownings over that 9-year period. But these rumors are not just in India. In fact, the Wales catfish in Europe we previously discussed has also been said to have eaten people before. But there's also supposed to be instances of it happening in the Ohio River. One of the earliest comes from 1780, when a story claimed that a man was eaten whole by a catfish, or even one as late as the 1970s, when a controversial news report stated that a boy was eaten by a catfish in Troy, Indiana. While there are also stories from South Africa where divers have claimed upon inspecting a dam wall, massive catfish tried to eat them through a cage. And speaking of dam repairs, that's another part of this story that might just make this whole thing an urban legend, because that dam story can be found in Central California, Lake Lanier, Georgia, Tennessee, Cumberland Lake in Kentucky, the Ohio River Valley, Wisconsin, even in Washington State. It's almost always a dam and a giant catfish, or, in the story of my local town, a giant catfish under the waterfalls. And you'll find that too. There's little variances, like the fish was as big as a Volkswagen, or in the 70s, a Buick, or sometimes even school buses. Heck, one of the most famous stories involves a man named Cato Mudcat Mudger, who in 1902 fought with a huge catfish in the Mississippi River. It was said to be so big that it took 14 men and a crane just to get it in, and when they opened up its stomach, they found a huge boot. So maybe what's really happening is catfish do get big, but divers are typically in the areas with poor visibility and, in addition, wearing masks which magnify and cause them to exaggerate the size underwater. Or it's possible people are even seeing sturgeon, which get much bigger. Or maybe they spotted a submerged log or stump or something like that. Maybe even a school of fish. And of course, they then sprinkle in a little folklore like fishermen tend to do, and then the story spreads. Of course, it's worth pointing out, people do go noodling, which is when an angler submerges his arm into holes or crevices under the water, trying to entice the catfish to bite him, and they do. There's also the fact that catfish never stop growing, but they do slow down with age, and since their lifespan is anywhere from 10 to 25 years, well, it could allow for a giant-sized man-eating catfish. If you have ever played a fantasy game like Dungeons & Dragons, chances are you have come across one magical item known as the Ever-Burning Torch, which as the name hints at, is a torch that cannot be extinguished. It of course worked based on the fantasy element of a magic spell that had been cast onto an ordinary torch. But, like a lot of things in Dungeons & Dragons, this too was based on stories from a very real ancient past. The ever-burning lamp, or torch, is a long-running mystery dating back for centuries, with many ancient scholars attesting to its veracity. But, were they real, or just a legend? First, let's look at some of the examples. One of the earliest mentions goes all the way back to Plutarch, the Greek historian in the 1st century AD. In one of his treatises on the decline of the oracles, he would note that a lamp had been burning over a door at the temple of Jupiter Ammon in Egypt, where priests had confided in him that the lamp stood in the open air and neither rain or wind could put it out, which matches other stories from the time, particularly at the temple of Apollo Carneus in Cyrene and the temple of Atterbane in Armenia. Then, if we move forward a couple of more decades, we have Greek geographer and traveler Pausanias, who would tell of a gold lamp he's seen at the temple of Minerva Polius in Athens. This lamp had actually been created by another ancient scholar, Callimachus, and what made it special was it was able to maintain a flame steadily for a year without needing any fuel added or even having its wick trimmed. This account is particularly important because for centuries, historians believed Pausanias was documenting these things based on secondhand accounts, but now they believe he witnessed them himself. More curious accounts pop up a half a millennia later in 527 AD, under the reign of Byzantine Emperor Justinian, when Persian soldiers on the border discovered an ever-burning lamp and image of Christ sealed over a gateway at Edessa, Syria. This lamp was enclosed to keep it safe from the wind, but according to its inscription, it was first lit in 27 AD, of course meaning that it had burned 500 years straight with no fuel added. The Persians, of course, put it out. But there's more. Let's jump 1,000 years into the future to 1534 AD. This would be when King Henry VIII broke England away from the Catholic Church. As part of that, he ordered the closing down of monasteries in Britain, and unsurprisingly, many tombs in the country were also hopelessly plundered. And it's one of these, in Yorkshire, that a burning lamp was found in the tomb of one Constantius Chlorus, father of the great Constantine. And since he died in 300 AD, the lamp presumably would have been burning for around 1200 years. And these are just a few of the stories, but there's actually over 170 medieval authors alone that document the ever-burning lamp. And before we look at the mystery of if they were real, let's look at how they would have worked, because there are many man-made ever-burning torches now. The difference is, they are almost always connected to natural gas. It shouldn't be a surprise, but these ever-burning lamps have often been said to have been created by ancient aliens, who then passed on the tech to ancient man, and at some point, it was all forgotten. But there is a more logical explanation, and that is our ancient ancestors, who were much smarter than we give them credit for, and a few inventors in their time somehow, some way, created these ever-burning lamps. How they did so is open to speculation. Some have theorized that it could have been an early form of using electricity. This theory is almost always packaged in with the Baghdad battery, which we have looked at in the past. Others think that it might be the work of alchemy, a certain blend of chemicals that made this burn forever. One fascinating suggestion was mercury. First of all, it's well known that that was one of the main chemicals that alchemists dabbled in, specifically because of the odd effects that it could create. Now, the blog I found this on, Trendfinity8.com, ran by Dr. Kathy Forty, drives really deep into how this would work, but to save time, I'm going to try to sum up. Basically, in 1705, the first ever gas discharge lamp was created, and it was operated with static electricity, sort of like a modern fluorescent lamp. It would eventually lead to other kinds of discharge light sources, and about 100 years later, one of these was a high-intensity discharge lamp, which used mercury vapor. So it's theorized the ionized gas from the heated mercury could build up in these lamps, or even in a sealed tomb, which in turn creates an electrical charge that fuels the light. In fact, there are some reports of tomb explorers finding silver liquid drops inside, which could be mercury, or why some tomb robbers and archaeologists have reported feeling ill or sick. Maybe it's not a curse, and it's just a mercury. In fact, beneath the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent in Mexico, there were allegedly large quantities of liquid mercury found by archaeologists. This would also match up with a few other accounts of someone finding an ever-burning torch, only to have it go out once the glass shattered. Others point to a somewhat more simple setup, one which used some kind of oil that was connected to a hidden chamber which fed it for centuries, or they could have even been connected to natural gas vents. Finally, we have the most skeptical take that the whole thing was nothing more than an urban legend passed down over centuries, a story, or at the very least, the lamps were being relit by custodians under the cover of night, and then the secret was kept for ritual purposes. May 10th, 1915. The second year of the First World War was well underway, and in the midst of all the troubling headlines that came with that, would be one story that draped the front pages of the newspapers all throughout the British Empire. The title read, "Torture of a Canadian Officer," and was reported by a war correspondent from Paris. Now, while war crimes were definitely not a surprise in the First World War, this one kinda drew the ire from the entire Western Alliance, because according to this article, Canadian soldiers who had been wounded at the Battle of Ypres were brought back behind lines for medical attention, and it's here they would tell commanding officers of something particularly cruel. German soldiers had apparently took a Canadian officer and crucified him. As you might imagine, not only was this seen as unjust, but it was pretty offensive. The men were pressed for more information on what exactly had happened, and according to them, the Germans had put the man on the wall by taking their bayonets and thrusting them through his hands and feet, before the last one was driven through his throat. Then they fired upon him. Now, according to them, they didn't specifically see it, yet had been told about it by soldiers with the Royal Dublin Fusiliers who had witnessed it. The British government, upon hearing the news, asked the Undersecretary of War for more information, which by now the story had changed to have claimed that 3 Canadian soldiers were bayoneted on a wooden structure. Since he had no information, a formal investigation was launched. 3 days later, a publication called The Times, the newspaper that had originally published the story, stated more information had came about which claimed that it was in fact one man, and he was a sergeant, and instead of being crucified on a building, he was transfixed to a wooden fence and stabbed repeatedly, and may have been dead before the deed was ever done. This is where the story would get more gruesome and more curious. 9 days after this first report, the government official who ordered the investigation, Robert Houston, would go back to the House of Commons with the information he had gathered, and he was asking other officials if they could confirm or deny. According to Houston, a Canadian detachment were temporarily driven back by the Germans, driven back so fast that they had to leave 40 wounded men behind at a barn. Upon stopping the Germans and pushing back, they recaptured the farm. They then quickly checked on their comrades, and that's when they found it. All of the soldiers but one had been bayoneted. This man was a sergeant, and apparently, in this large village was a crucifix in which the figure Christ was adorned on. The Germans had removed it and took this Canadian officer, while he was still alive, and crucified him. Still, in the fog of war, no one could get any confirmation one way or the other, and various stories spun around. One Canadian private claimed he had seen 3 soldiers bayoneted to a barn door, while a few English soldiers claimed to have only seen 1. Later it was discovered that the areas these soldiers reported the crucifixion had not even been occupied by the Germans. Most of the time, the soldier in question was Canadian, but a few people claimed it was a British soldier, and sometimes the crucifixion was said to have happened on a tree. At another point, one Canadian soldier claimed to have helped taken the crucified soldier down and believed he was from Brantford, Ontario. Later, the press would finally confirm the man's name was Sergeant Thomas Elliot of Brantford. There was only one problem with this. Sergeant Thomas Elliot was still alive, and he would confirm he was not the man that had been crucified, obviously. Regardless, the story was now an international incident, and of course, the Allies didn't waste a chance to use it as propaganda. But the war would wage on a few more years before the Germans were finally brought to the negotiating table. By this point, the crucifixion story was burned into the Canadian psyche, and a British sculptor, a Francis Derwin Wood, completed his work called Canada's Golgotha, Golgotha being the site of Jesus' crucifixion. The piece of art was not met without controversy. For one, the British and Canadian government still could not confirm the story, although they did at least have a name now. They believed it was a man named Sergeant Brant. Regardless of not being able to confirm it, the piece was set to go on display at a museum when the German government, who was still negotiating with the Allies, requested that the Canadian government come out and state the whole story was nothing but a hoax, or at least provide proof that it was real. Since the negotiations took precedence, Canada requested a more in-depth investigation, and then the Germans insisted on being part of it, and Canada balked and said, just forget it, we won't display the piece. Crazily enough, the Canadian government not only banned it from being shown in an exhibit, but they made it illegal to even take photos of, and that was in place for at least 70 years until 1989. Finally, by 1992, they allowed it to be placed into a museum. But here's the whole mystery. Was any of this ever true? Or was it a piece of clever wartime propaganda? And if it was real, who was the unfortunate soldier? Enter documentary filmmaker Ian Overton, who launched a big investigation on the events over 80 years later in 2002. After going over the archives and much of the evidence that was still available, he stated his findings, and that was, it looked legit, and the man's name was Sergeant Harry Band, not Brant, as was reported in 1919. Sergeant Band had been reported missing on April 24, 1915, near Ypres, and Band's family had received letters from fellow soldiers expressing their condolences, and a year later, one of these soldiers wrote his sister to state that he was pretty sure her brother was the man who had been crucified, and it was not a fictional account. Overton found more evidence though, one which included a note from a British nurse, and in this note, she discusses a Lance Corporal C.M. Brown who had told his nurse that a man named Sergeant Harry Band had been crucified after the Battle of Ypres on an open door of a barn with 5 bayonets in him. Now, since Harry Band's body was never officially recovered, it's impossible to verify, and just like this information found by Ian Overton in the early 2000s, it's still nothing 100% concrete. Likewise, the account varied so much in the details. Some accounts said it was a door, others said it was a tree, or a fence, or a barn. Sometimes it was bayonets, other times it was nails or spikes. Sometimes it was one man, other times 3. Others disputed if the man was alive when he was crucified, or if it was done so after. There's also a thing known as Field Punishment Number 1, which was the practice of tying a man to what basically looked like a fence post and leaving them there hours or days. Usually, the punishment was given for things like falling asleep on watch or some other minor infraction. Numerous soldiers would have seen instances like this on the front from a distance, and it simply could have been mistaken for crucifixion. However, it should be noted, the Germans really did hate the Canadians, as they were noted for being particularly brutal and unforgiving, as they were known to massacre surrendering and wounded soldiers. Actually, there's a long-held joke that the Geneva Conventions were specifically created because of Canada's treatment of German POWs, so the thought that Germans would crucify a Canadian soldier is not that far-fetched. But I'll leave it with you, legend or true story. September 1st, 1975, Chain of Ponds, Maine. It was the Labor Day weekend when the Newton family, Ron and Jill, along with their 6-year-old daughter, Kimberly, and 4-year-old son, Kurt, were enjoying the extended holiday weekend which they had spent camping. The campground they were at was about 6 miles away from the Canadian border, and it set out in the wilderness. It was around 9 that morning that the family got up and had a camper's breakfast and then began getting ready for their day of fun. Jill first walked over to the washroom about 50 yards away to clean off her muddy shoes, while Ron would jump into his truck with his axe, where he intended to drive down the campground road and cut up some more firewood. The daughter, Kimberly, remained behind and played a game, while 4-year-old Kurt jumped onto his tricycle, or big wheel, and rode around the camp. It would take Jill about 5 to 10 minutes to clean off her shoes real good and throw them across the clothesline and walk back to camp. When she arrived back, she found her daughter still there, but Kurt, nor his tricycle, were anywhere to be found. His mother at first wasn't too concerned and assumed he had just rode down the road with his father to get firewood, but she did walk around and ask some other campers if they had seen a little blonde boy riding around on his big wheel, but no one had seen him. And as she made her way around the camp, she ran into a man named Jack Hansen. He was the groundskeeper of the camp, and she asked him, had he seen Kurt? His response was he had not, but he had seen the tricycle about a quarter of a mile down the road. It had been moved to the side and was on the edge of the woods near a dump, so he grabbed it and took it up and threw it onto the garbage pile, since he assumed that's what the person had intended. But that wasn't all. The groundskeeper's daughter, who was 12, had seen Kurt pedaling down that way, and she called to him asking if his parents knew where he was, only for Kurt to ignore her and keep pedaling on down the road, presumably trying to follow his father's truck. Jill by now was worried, and she quickly headed towards that trash pile. And there it was, the big wheel. It was just sitting there, and no one was around, nor were there any sounds. She began to panic, but her fellow campers insisted that he must have went with his father to get firewood. However, they soon found out that's not where he was, because Ron would show back up and had not seen him. Authorities were quickly called, and the Fish and Game Warden with a small search party would soon arrive. They were actually pretty confident. The speculated little Kurt had tried to follow his father down the road on his tricycle, only to pull off to the side and walk into the woods looking for him, thinking he couldn't be far away. However, the pressure was on, because it was expected to drop down into the 20s that night. The search wore on all day, with no clues found, and unfortunately, night came and went, and the 30-person search party never found a thing. It would be early that next morning that bloodhounds arrived to the scene, and they would get the scent from Kurt's pajamas, but unfortunately, there was a mistake. By this point, the search party had swelled to over 200 people, and the dogs followed the scent for just a few yards and got confused from all the other scents, and they were never able to pick up Kurt's trail. Meanwhile, the weather got awful. It became cold, dark, and rainy. Not to mention, the terrain was treacherous. There were holes, rocks, boulders, and root cavities. But the search continued, and authorities would soon state that it was the most intensive wood search in the state's history. Soon, a favor was called in, and the Air Force would loan out a top-secret airplane that was equipped with the cutting-edge technology of its time, like infrared sensors and low-light sensor equipment made for night use. This aircraft would fly over the area for 3 hours, and It too found nothing. The search went on for days, and the aircraft made another flight. Dogs tried repeatedly to find a scent. 11 days later, the official search was called off, although family did continue to search for him, even returning on snowmobiles after the first big storm, which allowed them to go deeper into the woods. Still, nothing. But the family began to wonder, could he have been abducted? I mean, it was deep in the wilderness at a random campground, but how far could a 4-year-old have gotten in such a short amount of time? Well, investigators interviewed basically everyone at the campground, and even polygraphed a few. The only thing they got was the account of a white station wagon roaring out of the campground, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. This happened right after Kurt disappeared. That car was not registered to anyone at the campground, and even stranger, only one witness seen it. And after more interviews given by detectives, she admitted she may have been mistaken. Trackers were brought in to look at the road, which went out the back way of the campground, and they found no traffic had came through there in a while. Wildlife was also looked at, especially when they found out that someone had released a captive bear just a few miles away from the campground. But wildlife experts quickly ruled that out since there were no signs of an animal attack. Investigators sent out descriptions and photos nationwide, and calls came back from all over the country, as well as Canada. These were ran down and dismissed, or could never be verified. His parents did not quit though, and did something unprecedented. This was before the internet, and it was not easy to get the word out, but they, over a 6-month period, come up with a list of every superintendent of every school district in the country and sent out a letter along with 5 posters asking them to hang them up at the schools. The mailing alone cost $5,000, or about $30,000 in 2025. But this too never led to anything other than false leads. Today, most people lean towards the thought that Kurt simply wandered off following the sound of his father's axe and slipped or crawled into a concealed crevice or sinkhole, something like that, and succumbed to the elements or an injury. The fact that the bloodhounds were delayed on getting there makes it possible that he was simply overlooked, while some still lean towards the possibility that a stranger just happened to be going by and seen him, maybe the person in the white station wagon. They then snatched him and drove away. But I'll let you guys tell me what you think happened in the comment section below. May 7th, 1915. A ship that disembarked from New York would go on to be one of the most pivotal points in 20th century history. And no, I'm not talking about the Titanic. I'm talking about the RMS Lusitania. The ocean liner had seen a decrease in paying passengers since this was the middle of the First World War. Not to mention, it was only 3 months prior that Germany announced their intentions of unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they didn't care if the ship was full of weapons or tourists. It was going to be a target. Because of this, most of the passenger ships had lost a lot of money and were out of service, but not for the Lusitania. It kept trucking along, since it was hauling enough passengers regularly to make money. However, today it would meet its fate, when off the coast of Ireland, it was torpedoed and sunk. Of those 1,960 people on board, 1,197 perished. 128 of these were Americans, which is very important for one key reason. See, the US's policy up to that point was, hey, let's stay neutral and sell supplies to both sides. Britain, of course, wanted the US to be on its side, since they are known for their close alliance. But the American people felt strongly about staying out of it, and some actually supported Germany, until this moment. This was the turning point for American neutrality. Now the majority that wanted to stay neutral really felt disgust and bitterness towards the Germans, who for their part immediately announced a cease in the unrestricted submarine attacks. But it was too late, and it was one of the key geopolitical blunders of the early 20th century. But was it more than that? Could it be someone unexpected really wanted to sink that ship? And that unexpected someone was none other than Winston Churchill. Churchill had actually even written a letter where he stated that he hoped neutral shipping to the UK would eventually cause the US and Germany to come at odds. Now he did specifically cite the more ships they received, the better, but if some of them happened to run into trouble, that would be even better. However, that's a long ways from actual proof that he had anything to do with putting the ship in harm's way. But there are a few other things. For one, up to this point, the British Navy had been providing escorts for the Lusitania, along with many others. But on this crossing, this last one, Britain allowed the ship to go unescorted, in spite of the fact that they had 4 nearby destroyers, allegedly doing nothing, and knowing that there were 23 recent submarine attacks. One of these had happened very close to the route that the Lusitania was taking. There's also the fact that radio logs between the Lusitania and the British Admiralty on the last 3 days of its journey are classified to this day. But the biggest part was, the ship was also carrying 4 million rounds of ammunition, along with artillery shell casings. So it all seems like one of these conspiracies could be very true, except for a couple of key counterpoints. First of all, the US was nowhere near ready for war in 1915. It would have been more of a hindrance than a help, because if they mobilized, British munition supply lines would have taken a major hit, because the US was largely supplying them. Not to mention, Churchill was in France busy with the war when all this happened. In fact, there is some data to suggest that Britain was actually horrified and embarrassed about the whole thing, because, more than likely, someone was just slacking on their job. They weren't just taking alerts on their patrol seriously, or they were simply busy with other things, and it was a major screw-up. Sometimes, it's better to look guilty of a conspiracy than to look incompetent, and that's what some believe happened here. There's also the fact that the captain of the Lusitania, William Thomas Turner, made serious errors, or he just got too careless, like slowing down at a turn to a speed that almost made the ship a sitting duck, after he was specifically told not to do that, and he promptly ignored precautions like being told to zigzag and staying offshore. Then there's the stories about the ships not being escorted. First, the HMS Juno that was allegedly told not to interfere was much slower than the Lusitania and just couldn't keep up, while the others had been diverted for wartime movements. Not to mention, the Lusitania was repeatedly warned about submarines the entire way there, and they ignored it. One of these warnings officially came from Churchill himself. Speaking of, the origin of this theory actually gets its start from the enemies of Churchill, his political opponents, adding for more doubt. Today, most historians think that Britain's glamorous and elite navy just fumbled, and it ended in disaster for at least 1,200 people. And people being people, they began to look for conspiracies and found one to place on Churchill. 1790. The young American nation was growing with expansion, taking up large amounts of uncolonized land. Well, taking it from the Indians, and then categorizing them as territories. One of these would become known as the Southwest Territory, or territory south of the Ohio River, and it basically would become known as the state of Tennessee. But for now, it was just another territory with a capital called Knoxville. But this place we now know as a city in the heart of the state was nothing more than a town, if you can even call it that. But it did have a bi-weekly newspaper, and it's this newspaper we get our next mystery. Because February of 1794, the paper would come out with a very bizarre story. Apparently, a detachment of mounted infantry were sent 15 miles, or 30 depending on the source, from the Knoxville post up to the Cumberland Mountains, where they were set to explore an area called Cove Creek, where they would look for Indians that had been hostile towards the local settlers. Where this Cove Creek is located is up for debate, but there is such an area about 25 miles northwest, up near a town called Caryville, so this was most likely the location today. Now these men were on edge, because just 5 months prior, a large group of Chickamaugan warriors made an attempt to destroy Knoxville. According to them, they should not have to respect a treaty signed by white settlers and the Cherokee, who by their point of view had no rights to give that land away. And as a side note, the Chickamauga were actually a group that were once Cherokee, but had split off. 18th century US geopolitics were crazy. Regardless, the Chickamauga had made a mistake. Instead of destroying the southwest capital of Knoxville, they destroyed a Knox County home known as Cabot Station. In this raid, they killed everyone inside, man, woman, and child. Now the Chickamauga and their feared leader, Doublehead, were public enemy number one, which brings us back to the expedition of terrified men. They were being led by a 28-year-old captain, John Beard, who reported directly to General John Sevier, whose orders were shoot at Indians only. Also with this party was a man whom time has mostly forgot, and we don't know much about him. It's not even clear if he was a soldier or a civilian guide, but his name was Ensig MacDonald, and he, with a few other men, were out ahead of the much larger party. And it's these men who, upon coming to the Cove Creek area, were startled by something they seen standing there in the woods. They would later document this occasion by simply calling it a creature, taken directly from the Knoxville Gazette. It only had 2 legs and stood almost upright, covered with scales of a black, brown, and a light yellow color in spots like rings, a white tuft on the top of its head about 4 feet high, a head as big as a 2-pound stone, and large eyes of a fiery red. This creature, whatever it was, did not seem like it was in a good mood to see the men. It stood in a defensive, or maybe aggressive posture, in what became a tense 3-minute standoff. Finally, the scout named MacDonald bravely walked forward, and as soon as he got close to this animal, he swung his sword. The creature, writhing in pain, jumped about 8 feet in the air, came back down, and landed in the same spot, and it immediately began spewing out red matter from its mouth, which the men stated looked a lot like blood, which suggests they weren't altogether sure. By this point though, it didn't matter, because this reaction terrified them, and they turned and took off running into a thicket, occasionally looking behind them to make sure this thing wasn't following. The article doesn't mention how long the men hid in wait, but I can only assume it was a good while, since they were seemingly pretty terrified. However, they finally got a hold of their courage and began walking back to the area with their weapons drawn. But when they got there, the thing had obviously fled the area. They did, however, find its tracks that it left behind, and they described it as resembling that of a goose, but larger. Now what makes this account even stranger is the paper would go on to elaborate that the Indians in this area had told the white settlers that in this part of the mountain was a creature with that description, and when using its breath, it could kill a man if he does not immediately jump into the water, which sounds suspiciously like a dragon. In fact, this creature that would soon earn the moniker Creature of the Cumberlands would get another name in the years that followed, that of the Cumberland Dragon. Regardless, the story got so much attention that it soon spread from Tennessee and was copied to papers all over the country, as well as even jumping over the pond and being circulated in Britain. That leaves the main question though, what exactly did these men see? Surely it was not a dragon. On this one, it's hard to say because so little detail was actually provided. It's just possible they did see some kind of large predatory bird that they were simply not familiar with, maybe an eagle or vulture, or even a crane with a skin disease. It could have been a wild turkey. They can stand nearly 4 feet tall, and their prints do look goose-like. Or heck, maybe it was some kind of reptile. Though it wasn't as likely back then, there were some people that owned exotic pets, like snakes and lizards. Maybe someone had an alligator. And if you think that's crazy, just remember that John Quincy Adams, the 6th president, would keep an alligator in the White House East Room bathtub. So it wasn't out of the realm of possibility someone had an alligator here and just released it into the woods. Another thought is that these men, who were already scared out of their wits, simply exaggerated due to the extreme stress they were put under. Of course, newspapers back then were known to print fanciful tales of wild creatures, especially dragons, in an attempt to sell more issues. One thing that is interesting about all this is 4 years after the events, William Blount, one of the founding fathers, and the one and only Southwest Territory governor, would write a letter to someone in which he discussed the creature, and he called it a chiclasia. What makes that intriguing is we have no idea where he got that word, because it's not documented anywhere else, but it must have been somewhat known for him to have discussed it in that letter 4 years later. And I know the simple solution is that that was a Cherokee word, but it's actually not found anywhere in any Native American language. So that's odd. Speaking of natives though, many have suggested that the Cherokee stories of an animal in the mountains may have been the Uktena, which is basically a horned serpent. It's spread all throughout Native American cultures, and it varies, but they are usually associated with the water, rain, lightning, and thunder. The main problem with this is, the creature reported by MacDonald wasn't really that similar to the Uktena. So, was this a fictional account? Or did these men really see something? Let me know in the comments section below. 1985, Dodleston, England. Ken Webster and his girlfriend Debbie, along with their friend Nick, were renovating an old 18th century cottage together. But it's this simple act of renovation that would start off this weird mystery that only became an internet mystery decades later in 2011, when a blogger, Nick Pence, began documenting the story. The case started strangely with the three finding six-toed footprints which went up one of the dusty walls. Assuming it was a prank, they cleaned the wall and just painted over it, only for those same prints to return the next day. But it wasn't just that. They found strange footprints in the dust on the floor too. And then, cat food they had left out had been stacked into a pyramid. They were also subjected to frequent cold gusts of wind, shadows moving about, and the feeling of a strange presence watching them. However, Ken, who had planned on moving in, was fairly sure that it was his buddy Nick who was pranking him. Or maybe someone else, and he ignored the weirdness and moved on in. Before long, Ken would decide to bring a computer home from school where he taught at. And this is back in the earliest days of computers. But when Ken got this computer home, he would have a strange message pop up. Actually, it was a poem, which read, "True are the nightmares of a person that fears. Safe are the bodies of the silent world. Turn, pretty flower, turn towards the sun, for you shall grow and sow. But the flower reaches too high and withers in the burning light. Get your bricks. Pussycat, pussycat went to London to seek fame and fortune. Faith must not be lost, for this shall be your redeemer." Which is certainly a weird poem. But it got stranger, because a few days later, Ken would get a second message. This time, it was not a poem, but written in a very old form of British English. It read, "I write on behalf of many. What strange words you speak. You are a good man who has a fanciful woman, and you live in my house, with lights which the devil makes. It was a great crime to have stolen my house, L.W. This L.W.'s first name would be revealed later on as Luca, and he claimed to be messaging them from the year 1546. Over the next year and a half, Ken would receive messages like these through Luca, and he became obsessed with figuring out who was really doing it. He began responding to the messages, asking questions like where he was from, and who the leader was in his time. The person, or thing, messaging him would reply, but he often left many of the questions unanswered, and he would fire off his own questions trying to find out more about Ken and Debbie. However, in all this correspondence, Luca's real name would come out, and he was a man named Thomas Harden. So of course, Ken and Debbie, being very curious, decided to do some researching to see if this man really existed. And this was way back in the old days, before you could find anything on the internet, so they actually had to go to a library to do real research. It's here that they finally found out that Thomas actually existed, and he was the vicar of a church in Gloucestershire in the 1550s. This is already strange enough on its own, but it got weirder yet, because although Ken and Debbie had learned much about Thomas, he was learning more about them. In his messages, he started commenting about things going on at his newly renovated cottage, like some of the photos on the kitchen table that had been left out by Ken. And it got weirder yet, because at some point, Ken would mention living in the year 1985, which threw Thomas off. And he would reply, "But I thought you were from the year 2109, like your friend who brought the box of lights." Ken was stunned at this point, and logically, the only thing he knew to do was to try to write the person in 2109 to see who that was. This individual would tell Ken and Debbie and Thomas they were going to change history together, and he, 2109, who might actually be an AI, will be nudging them along the way. So as you can see, This is all getting very strange and confusing. Next, 2109 starts messaging Ken and Debbie and tells them this is all part of an experiment that they are in. This went on until Ken finally had enough and called on a paranormal investigation team to come look over the cottage. They visited and studied 3 times and were never able to come up with any answers. Shortly after this, Thomas said he was being forced away from his land and he never messaged again, but left them with a little promise. He said he was going to leave them a book that they would discover in the future, which was supposed to confirm everything, I guess. Regardless, this book has never been found. So this is a pretty crazy one, and the theories are pretty obvious. The first and biggest theory is that it was a hoax by none other than Ken and Debbie. In fact, Ken would actually go on to write a book about it 4 years later called The Vertical Plane, meaning he did in fact seek some money for the whole story. It was just kind of forgotten about or never made big news until it was rediscovered in that blog in 2011. There's also another strange caveat. That PC he was using was a BBC Micro, which did not have the ability to network, nor could it run background processes, meaning any genuine remote or automated messaging was entirely impossible, suggesting any text on the screen was manually entered by someone in this dimension and time. But that doesn't necessarily mean Ken, because the BBC Micros had sideways ROM slots and could be used by someone technically adept enough to boot up a custom program and set it to display upon powering up. And since Ken was constantly taking floppy disks between home and school, a prankster there could have placed the text on it then and set it to display upon booting up. Of course, the other 2 theories are of the more supernatural type. First, it was a real poltergeist, those ghosts that can cause random objects to move, or to make footprints show up, or send messages to a computer screen. Next is time slip. Those messages that came from Luca, or Thomas, really did display correct spellings and word usages for mid-16th century English, which means the prankster was very intelligent in that field, or he was a real time slip. Of course, none of this explains the 2109 entity. All in all, a strange one. And that brings us to the end of this video. Thanks guys for the suggestions, and if I didn't use yours, don't be upset. I'll come back to it in the future. Thanks again guys. Goodbye, and good night.